Je remercie le secrétaire général de sa déclaration. Le secrétaire général devra quitter la séance à 9h50 en raison d'autres obligations. Nous tenons à le remercier une nouvelle fois d'avoir participé à la séance d'aujourd'hui. Je donne à présent la parole à Monsieur Nickolay Mladenov.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Members of the Security Council, Secretary-General Guterres, I'm devoting my regular briefing on the situation in the Middle East to the 14th report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. The written report you have already received, and it covers the period from the 21st of March to the 4th of June this year. Before turning to developments that have occurred since the written report, I would like to reiterate the Secretary-General's grave concern over the continuing threat of Israeli annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank, a process officials have said could begin in weeks. Deliberations over this move have brought this long-standing conflict to a critical juncture. Annexation could irrevocably alter the nature of Israeli-Palestinian relations. It risks upending more than a quarter of a century of international efforts in support of a future viable Palestinian state living in peace, security, and mutual recognition with the State of Israel. The Secretary-General has just unequivocally stated that any move to annex occupied Palestinian territory would have serious implications in terms of international law, the two-state solution, and the prospects of a negotiated sustainable peace. International and regional opposition has also been widespread. European leaders continue to voice their opposition to annexation and have also affirmed that it would amount to a violation of international law. Powerful statements rejecting such a move have been issued in the past weeks by His Majesty the King of Jordan, the Arab League, and leaders across the Arab world, including a strong message directly to the Israeli people from the United Arab Emirates. In addition to the official statements, we have witnessed opposition to the move from Israeli and Palestinian civil society, think tanks, academics, and many others. Multiple opinion polls have indicated that Israelis are deeply divided over the issue and do not consider it as a priority, as the country is in the grips of an economic crisis and rising unemployment. Thousands of Israelis have protested the move at gatherings in Tel Aviv's Rabin Square and other locations across the country. Mr. President, recognizing that both peoples have a right to live in their ancestral home, 27 years ago, Israeli and Palestinian leaders agreed to embark on a noble but difficult road to resolve the conflict through negotiations, without taking unilateral action and in order to reach a final status agreement on a just peace. Today, we are further than ever from this goal. As the prospect of a negotiated two-state solution is undercut, the specter of anger, radicalization, and violence emerges. Beyond the legal, security, and economic implications, the threat of unilaterally annexing parts of the West Bank will send one message and one message alone. Bilateral negotiations cannot achieve peace. We cannot allow this to happen. No good can come out of the breakdown of dialogue and communications. Diplomacy must be given a chance. All of us who believe in the legitimate right of both Palestinians and Israelis to self-determination, security, and a brighter future must reject this move and consolidate efforts to preserve a sustainable two-state solution. This is why I ask you today to join the Secretary-General in his call for an immediate re-engagement with no preconditions between the Middle East Quartet, the United States, the Russian Federation, the European Union, and the United Nations, and the Palestinian leadership, Israel, and the countries of the region. This is in order to find a way out of the current crisis. I believe that only by working together we can restore meaningful Israeli-Palestinian dialogue and improve stability and conditions for people on the ground. Such discussions have been dormant for too long, letting both sides slip further apart along diverging paths. Unilateral action has made the goal appear even more distant. Based on shared principles and aspirations, we can identify realistic steps to avoid increasing polarization and to advance the goal of two states living side by side in peace and security, integrated into the region. In the interests of peace, I urge the Israeli and Palestinian leadership to take this opportunity and to return to the path of engagement. Mr. President, in response to the threat of annexation, the Palestinian leadership declared itself absolved of all agreements and understandings with Israel and the United States. It has subsequently halted all bilateral contacts. This decision has had and will increasingly have a dramatic impact on all aspects of Palestinian life. Particularly worrisome is the decision to stop accepting the clearance revenues that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. Adding to the economic uncertainty caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Palestinian Authority has now lost 80% of its monthly revenue. This gap cannot be filled by donors. Palestinians in Gaza who have lived with closures and under the control of Hamas for more than a decade are particularly vulnerable. The ending of civilian coordination will not allow them to receive life-saving treatment. Already an 8-month-old infant has lost his life due to this situation. Surely there must be a red line when it comes to the lives of children. The United Nations and other international organizations are increasingly being asked to perform coordination responsibilities. While we are prepared to provide support on an emergency basis, the UN cannot replace the Palestinian Authority. It is critical that humanitarian and other assistance not be delayed or stopped. Mr. President, in the coming weeks, decisions may be reached that will do irreparable damage to Palestinian and Israeli societies, to the security and economic well-being of both peoples. This bleak vision, however, is not yet a fait accompli. The window is closing, but there is still time to avert chaos. It will require a concerted effort by all stakeholders and the will to take political risks to achieve peace. As a first step, I joined the Secretary-General in calling on Israel to abandon its plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. Mr. President, allow me to turn briefly also to significant developments since the written report has been circulated. In terms of settlement-related activities, on the 9th of June, Israel's High Court of Justice struck down a controversial 2017 law that enabled wide-scale expropriation of private Palestinian land and the retroactive legalization under Israeli law of thousands of housing units in Israeli settlements. The court ruled that the law was unconstitutional due to its violation of Palestinian rights of property and equality. Meanwhile, one Palestinian was killed and 44 injured, including 6 children, during demonstrations, clashes, and other incidents across the occupied Palestinian territory. 5 were injured by live ammunition. 3 Israelis were injured with stones when stones were thrown at a bus traveling through the West Bank. A total of 45 structures were demolished on grounds of lack of permit in Area C in East Jerusalem, displacing some 28 people and otherwise affecting an additional 250. On June 23rd, a 20-year-old Palestinian man from Mideast was shot dead by the ISF in an apparent car ramming attack at a checkpoint, and an IDF soldier was also injured. Settler-related violence incidents during the reporting period were concentrated mainly in Hebron's H2 area and in the Nablus governorate. In Gaza, despite the relative calm, the launching of incendiary balloons and devices continued, with some 20 devices launched over the fence into Israel. On the 15th of June, a rocket was launched from Gaza towards Israel, landing in an open field and causing no damage. In retaliation, the Israeli Defense Forces targeted several Hamas targets in the Strip. Meanwhile, the Kerem Shalom crossing for goods into Gaza has continued to operate as normal. However, the Palestinian Civil Affairs Committee in Gaza has stopped receiving and processing permit applications for Gaza residents and ended all communication with Israeli authorities. As a result, hundreds of patients, including many children needing life-saving medical treatment, have not been able to exit the Strip. Mr. President, UNRWA's financial situation remains a serious concern to all of us. I thank Jordan and Sweden for their efforts to mobilize support for the agency, including yesterday's pledging conference, which they co-chaired with the participation of the Secretary-General. I welcome the pledges that were announced although they fall well short of the needs of UNRWA, and its funding gap remains extremely serious. I encourage Member States to support the agency to ensure its operations can continue throughout 2020. Mr. President, in closing, I would like to again highlight the immense risks we face over the coming weeks and months as we confront the very real possibility of annexation and its consequences. If implemented, these steps could dramatically alter local dynamics, triggering instability across the occupied Palestinian territory and maybe beyond. This conflict has been marked by periods of extreme violence, but never before has the risk of escalation been accompanied by a political horizon so distant, an economic situation so fragile, and a region so volatile. It is crucial for all stakeholders to take action that will enable the parties to step back from the brink. The goal must be to urgently re-engage in dialogue that will halt unilateral steps, chart a positive way forward, and avoid a descent into chaos. Everyone must do their part in the coming weeks to preserve and promote the prospect of ending the occupation and achieving a negotiated two-state solution based on international law, UN resolutions, and bilateral agreements. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur Mladenov de son exposé. Je donne maintenant la parole à son Excellence Monsieur Ahmed Aboul-Rait.
Thank you, Mr. President, Secretary-General, distinguished members of the Security Council. I will be candid and straightforward in my talk today. It is the duty and responsibility of this Council to address any situation that threatens international peace and security. The Arab League firmly believes that the possible move by the Israeli government to annex parts of the occupied Palestinian territory would constitute, if implemented, a serious threat to regional stability with broader ramifications on the international security and the world. Since 1993, the Palestinians have wisely chosen the path of peace and coexistence. They signed interim agreements with Israel in the hope that this would pave the way for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the June 4, 1967 lines, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Yet, for 3 decades, real peace and the creation of an independent Palestinian state remained elusive. Israeli settlement activities expanded, and the logic of perpetual occupation and domination has entrenched. Negotiations stumbled, were suspended numerous times, and have led to nowhere. Despair is dominating the Palestinian mood and scene. Despite these setbacks, the two-state solution remains the only paradigm accepted by both parties and endorsed by the international community. The ambitious Arab Peace Initiative was launched back in 2002, adopting the same parameters as a means to achieve regional peace and normalization with Israel. If implemented, Israeli annexation plans would not only be detrimental to the chances of peace today, but will destroy any prospects for peace in the future. Palestinians will totally lose faith in a negotiated settlement. I am afraid Arabs too will lose interest in regional peace. A new dark reality will set in vis-à-vis this conflict and in the region at large. Israelis wrongly believe that the status quo is sustainable. Actually, it is not. If the two-state solution is removed from the table, a one-state reality will take its place, and this is going to create a whole different reality and dynamics. What is also at stake here is the effectiveness of your August Council. I hope you recognize the urgency of the matter and the gravity of Israeli policies. It is incumbent upon the Council to exert its influence on Israel so it refrains from any unilateral measures that will further inflame tensions and endanger stability and peace in the Middle East. I would even say they have the potential of igniting a religious war in and beyond our region. A religious war, and that is not a small play. We should be united in our condemnation and rejection of this uncancelled, uncalled for provocation. And Israel must be made to recognize that its nefarious, self-centered plans will remain inadmissible and will never gain any international acceptance. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Son Excellence Monsieur Aboul Hayt de sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole aux membres du Conseil de sécurité. Je donne la parole à Son Excellence Sir Louis Straker, vice-premier ministre et ministre des Affaires étrangères et du Commerce international de Saint-Vincent et les Grenadines.
Mr. President, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, let me begin by thanking the briefers for their remarks on the evolving situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The long-cherished dream of peace in the Middle East is one we must continue to toil for, with the hope that future generations of Palestinians and Israelis can work, play, study, and pray beside one another in a tranquil and tolerant atmosphere. Mr. President, security is, at its very core, a collective project. It denotes a lasting relationship based on the foundational values of trust and respect, in which concerned parties choose peaceful coexistence over fear and coercion. It is in this regard that St. Vincent the Grenadines stands firm in its condemnation of ongoing settlement activities across the West Bank, which constitute clear violations of international law that gravely imperil the peace process. The internationally agreed two-state solution based on pre-1967 borderlines remains the most credible path on our painstaking quest for peace between Israel and Palestine. We implore the State of Israel to adhere to the provisions of all relevant United Nations resolutions, including Resolution 2334, which reflect the international community's position on the occupied Palestinian territories. Only through dialogue and compromise, respectful of the principles of international law, can security for Israel be assured as Palestinian claims to dignity, equality, and human rights are honored. History has taught us that lasting peace can only be achieved through sincere attempts at reconciliation. And reconciliation is only possible when justice and fairness pave the way to mutual satisfaction and harmony. As unilateral annexation of the West Bank looms, the narrow window for a sustainable peace is rapidly closing. Annexation would permanently alter the security landscape and destabilize the region. St. Vincent the Grenadines urges all parties to let judgment and pragmatism prevail. We call on the State of Israel to immediately cease all plans for annexation and return to the bargaining table to negotiate with their Palestinian neighbors in good faith. To this end, we encourage all members of the international community to facilitate this much-needed dialogue as the critical first step towards an solution. We also encourage renewed international...
Sorry, League of Arab States, please mute your microphone. League of Arab States, please mute your microphone. League of Arab States, please mute your microphone.
We also encourage renewed international financial support to the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, which provides vital humanitarian assistance and social protections to millions of Palestinian refugees. As such, we welcome the recently convened pledging conference to mobilize political and financial support for UNRWA. Excellencies, today we stand at a dangerous crossroad. The core principles upon which our United Nations was founded are gradually eroding. On issues as complex and consequential as the fragile peace process in the Middle East, we can ill afford the ongoing repudiation of the bedrock principles of our multilateral system. The political independence and territorial integrity of all states must be safeguarded as we cast our collective gaze towards the urgent challenges of COVID-19 and the ever-growing climate change. During this 75th year of the United Nations, we must remain candid and upright in our pronouncements. Continued peace in the face of grave injustice, wheresoever and by whomsoever committed, is in itself the blank canvas upon which immense human suffering is rendered. At this critical juncture, we cannot be separated in interest or divided in purpose. We must stand together resolutely and unequivocally demand peace and justice for all. I thank you.
Je remercie son Excellence Straker de sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à son Excellence Monsieur Noureddine Erré, ministre tunisien des Affaires étrangères.
Thank you, Mr. President. السيد الرئيس، السيد الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، السيد الأمين العام لجامعة الدول العربية، السيدات والسادة الوزراء أصحاب السعادة. في البداية أعرب عن فائق التقدير لمعالي الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة السيد أنطونيو غوتيريس على كلمته الافتتاحية، وأجدد له تثمين تونس لجهوده المتواصلة لدفع مسار السلام في الشرق الأوسط. كما أرحب بمعالي السيد أحمد أبو الغيط الأمين العام لجامعة الدول العربية، وأشكره على الإحاطة التي قدمها لأعضاء المجلس. كما يطيب لي في أن أتوجه بالشكر للرئاسة الفرنسية لمجلس الأمن على تفاعلها الإيجابي مع طلب عقد هذه الجلسة على المستوى الوزاري، وأرحب بنظرائي وممثلي الدول الشقيقة والصديقة. سيد الرئيس، ينعقد هذا الاجتماع الهام والأمم المتحدة تستعد للاحتفال بعيدها الخامس والسبعين بكل المعاني والدلالات العميقة لهذه المناسبة التي تمثل موعدا متجددا لتأكيد تمسكنا جميعا بمقاصد ميثاق منظمتنا، وتأكيد الأهمية المحورية والمتجددة للقوانين والمواثيق الدولية في تنظيم العلاقات الدولية وتعزيز مقومات الأمن والسلم الدوليين. ومن المفارقات أن اجتماعنا يأتي بالمقابل أياما قليلة قبل محطة أخرى في مسار استهتار إسرائيل بالشرعية الدولية، متمثلة في الموعد الذي أعلن عنه رئيس حكومتها للبدء في تنظيم أو في تنفيذ مخطط ضم أجزاء من الأراضي الفلسطينية في خرق جسيم وفاضح للقانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية، وفي تحد صارخ للمجموعة الدولية التي عبرت من خلال المواقف الوطنية الرسمية والشعبية وعبر المنظمات والتجمعات الإقليمية والجغرافية عن رفض واضح لهذه السياسات العدوانية. سيد الرئيس، على امتداد أكثر من 7 عقود أمعنت إسرائيل القوة القائمة بالاحتلال، ولا زالت في ممارساتها العدوانية ضد الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق، وفي الاستيلاء على الأراضي وهدم البيوت وتنفيذ المشاريع الاستيطانية وانتهاك المقدسات، إلى جانب تجديد إجراءات الإغلاق والحصار الجائر والخنق الاقتصادي وكل أشكال العقاب الجماعي الأخرى. وبالموازاة مع ذلك، ورغم الجهود الدولية والقرارات العديدة لمجلس الأمن والجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة والاتفاقات المبرمة، لم تكتف الحكومات الإسرائيلية المتعاقبة بتجاهل تلك القرارات وانتهاكها، بل أقدمت على اتخاذ سلسلة من القرارات والإجراءات الأحادية في إطار سياسة فرض الأمر الواقع لتغيير الوضع القانوني والتاريخي للأراضي العربية المحتلة وتنفيذ مخططاتها التوسعية، من ذلك القرارات المتعلقة بضم القدس الشرقية وفرض سيادة إسرائيل عليها وتغيير تركيبتها الديمغرافية وتهويد أحيائها، وقرار فرض السيادة على الجولان السوري المحتل وما يسمى بقانون الدولة القومية، ومشاريع بناء الآلاف الوحدات الاستيطانية، والآن مخطط ضم أجزاء من الضفة الغربية بما في ذلك غور الأردن وشمال البحر الميت. سيد الرئيس، إن مخطط الضم المذكور يمثل انتهاكا جسيما للقانون الدولي واستهتارا بالقرارات الأممية وإيغالا في العدوان على الحقوق المشروعة للشعب الفلسطيني، وإحباطا لأي مسعى لإعادة إطلاق مسار السلام الذي يمثل ضرورة ملحة إقليميا ودوليا، كما ستكون له تداعيات بالغة الخطورة على مجمل الأوضاع بالمنطقة. وإزاء كل ذلك، فإن تونس تدعو مجددا من منبر مجلس الأمن المجتمع الدولي إلى تحمل مسؤولياته في هذه المرحلة الحاسمة من خلال التصدي لهذا المخطط ومنع تنفيذه، باعتبار ذلك أولوية ملحة من أجل حماية القانون الدولي وإرادة السلام ومنع انزلاق الأوضاع في المنطقة نحو دوامة جديدة من العنف والانفلات. كما تؤكد على ضرورة إبلاغ الجانب الإسرائيلي رسالة قوية وواضحة مفادها رفض المجتمع الدولي لمخطط الضم وعدم السماح بمواصلة انتهاك القانون الدولي وتعريض الأمن والسلم والاستقرار في المنطقة والعالم للخطر. ومن منطق ثوابت سياستها الخارجية، فإن تونس تجدد اليوم تأكيد موقفها الثابت والمبدئي في الوقوف إلى جانب الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق في نضاله من أجل استرجاع حقوقه المشروعة وإقامة دولته المستقلة ذات السيادة على أرضه في حدود 4 جوان 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية، وتسوية جميع قضايا الحل النهائي، وذلك في إطار سلام عادل وشامل وفق قرارات الشرعية الدولية وحل الدولتين ومبادرة السلام العربية. كما تؤكد تونس أن الحقوق الفلسطينية لا تسقط بالتقادم، وأن إجراءات سلطات الاحتلال الإسرائيلية باطلة وكل ما ينتج عنها مرفوض ولا تترتب عنه أي آثار قانونية. السيد الرئيس، إن رفضنا المطلق لمخطط الضم ودعوتنا لتضافر الجهود الدولية للتصدي له ومنع تنفيذه عاجلا وآجلا لا تضاهيه إلا مطالبتنا بإنهاء الاحتلال باعتباره السبب المباشر والعنوان للمأساة القائمة منذ أكثر من 70 سنة بكل ما رافقها وانجر عنها من اعتداءات وانتهاكات ما زال الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق يتعرض لها بشكل متواصل وممنهج. وفي هذا الإطار فإننا نجدد مطالبتنا مجلس الأمن بالعمل على حمل إسرائيل على إنهاء الاحتلال والانسحاب من كافة الأراضي الفلسطينية والعربية إلى حدود 4 جوان 1967 وفق جدول زمني محدد. كما نشدد على أهمية العمل على إعادة إطلاق مسار تحقيق السلام العادل والشامل وفق المرجعيات الدولية المتفق عليها. كما تؤكد تونس على أهمية توفير الحماية الدولية للشعب الفلسطيني وإنهاء الحصار الجائر المفروض على غزة ووضع حد لكافة أشكال التمييز والعقاب الجماعي الأخرى. وتدعو المجموعة الدولية إلى مواصلة دعمها لجهود السلطة الفلسطينية من أجل مجابهة التحديات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والإنسانية المتفاقمة نتيجة تواصل الاحتلال والتهديد الوبائي المستجد. في الختام، تؤكد تونس مجددا أن المنطقة لا يمكن أن تستعيد أمنها واستقرارها وتنعم شعوبها بالعيش في سلام ما لم يتم التوصل إلى التسوية العادلة والشاملة للصراع العربي الإسرائيلي. أجدد شكري وتقديري للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة السيد أنطونيو غوتيريس وللرئاسة الفرنسية لمجلس الأمن ولكل الدول الشقيقة والصديقة التي عبرت عن تمسكها بالقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقيم الكونية للسلام. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you.
Je remercie son Excellence, Monsieur Herrey, de sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole à son Excellence, Madame Retno Marsudi, ministre indonésienne des Affaires étrangères.
President, although the Council regularly meets to discuss the situation in Palestine, it is clear that our meeting today is far from a regular one. The fact that the ministers and deputy minister participated in this meeting is clear evidence that the situation is very concerning. Mr. President, the Secretary-General in his new report warned us of the crucial situation at hand posed by the occupying power and the threat of its annexation in Palestine. For far too long, the Palestinian people have suffered injustice, grave violation of human rights, and a deteriorating humanitarian situation. With the looming threat of annexation, the future of Palestine is at stake. Now it is up to us whether we want to stand on the side of the international law or turn a blind eye, stand on the other side, and allow acts against international law and principle continue to take place. We must and should reject the plan of annexation based on the following points. First, the formal annexation would constitute a clear violation of international law. The de facto annexation or the creeping annexation has breached international law. If we allow the de facto annexation to manifest into formal annexation, then we are setting a dangerous precedent that somehow occupying the land of others by way of annexation can be lawful under international law. It is an impunity on itself, and our silence signals approval. So let us all show our strong objection in all fora, both by words and action, that annexation is illegal. Second, the formal annexation is an open challenge to the Security Council. It tests the credibility and the legitimacy of this council. The official declaration of annexation in May has justified the Security Council to swiftly act under the UN Charter. My question now, why should the Council wait for the annexation to happen in order to assume its function? In short, no matter who poses a threat to the international peace and security, they should be held accountable before the Council. There should be no double standard. And third, and most importantly, Mr. Chairman, the formal annexation will destroy all prospect of peace. This will also create instability in the region and beyond. There is an urgent need for a credible peace process that allows all relevant parties to work on equal footing. Hence, it is high time to start a credible multilateral peace process based on internationally agreed parameters. For Indonesia, lasting peace can only be achieved based on the two-state solution. My final point, Mr. President, is to address the humanitarian needs in Palestine. The pandemic has worsened the hardship faced by the Palestinian people. It is crucial to enhance our support for international humanitarian agencies, particularly the UNRWA. Just yesterday, I announced Indonesia increased contribution to the Palestine as well as to the UNRWA during the pledging conference. Our support to Palestine will also be channeled through the Palestinian Authority and humanitarian agencies. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, injustice prevails, not because of the absence of justice, but because we allow it to do so. So it is time to put a stop to it. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Je remercie son Excellence de sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole à son Excellence Monsieur James Cleverly, ministre d'État pour le Moyen-Orient et l'Afrique du Nord du Royaume-Uni de Grande-Bretagne et d'Irlande du Nord.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Coordinator Mladenov, and to the Secretary-General of the League of Arab States for their respective briefings. Mr. President, I address the Council today at a critical juncture. Like many, I am troubled and frustrated by the lack of progress towards a two-state solution. In 1947, at the end of the British Mandate over Palestine, the General Assembly confirmed the international community's view of the need for a partition into two states. In 1993, the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized Israel and accepted the 1967 lines as the basis for the future boundary between Israel and Palestinian territories. It was a moment of great optimism. It marked Palestinian agreement to the solution Israel itself had accepted in 1947 and confirmed the only solution that the world could see. Despite moments of optimism, both parties have struggled to find the common ground needed for a lasting, peaceful settlement. It has always been true that any peace settlement needs the support of both peoples, because a settlement and peace must be agreed and not imposed. But it also needs pragmatism and flexibility from both sides. The Secretary-General, in his report on the implementation of Resolution 2334, and the Special Coordinator in his briefing to the Council today, have outlined the many elements that have stalled in the peace process. We have heard about settlement expansions, increases in demolitions, seizures, and worsening settler violence. The UK has long urged Israel to end these counterproductive activities. Meanwhile, Palestinian militants have fired rockets and launched incendiary devices from Gaza, threatening Israel's security. Israelis have suffered from the scourge of terrorism and anti-Semitic incitement. Let me be clear. The United Kingdom is committed to Israeli security. We condemn all forms of incitement and anti-Semitism wholeheartedly. Most critically, Israel's plans to annex part of the West Bank pose a significant and possibly existential threat to the peace process. The UK has been clear in this Council and beyond that unilateral action is unacceptable. Annexation risks signalling Israeli rejection of the very solution Israel and the international community agreed in 1947. As my Prime Minister said on the 16th of June, the UK strongly opposes annexation, which would breach international law. The United Kingdom will not recognise any unilateral attempt to change the border. Such a step would go against the rules-based international order and the UN Charter. Annexation could not go unanswered, and we implore Israel to reconsider. Such a step has the potential to trigger regional instability, threatening Israel's own security. It could have a real impact on Israel's relations with its neighbours, as well as the wider international community. And let us not forget the consequences for those most directly affected, the Palestinian people. We cannot predict the implications that a loss of hope would bring. We cannot say with certainty, but we can say with some degree of certainty that it is the extremists who would benefit most. Mr. President, we have to find another way. A lasting agreement will only be achieved by real movement towards renewed peace, by negotiation. Negotiations that create a viable and sovereign Palestinian state, living in peace and security side by side with Israel, based on the 1967 borders, with agreed land swaps, Jerusalem as the shared capital of both states, and a just, fair, agreed, and realistic settlement for refugees. I address this Council today to express the United Kingdom's willingness to stand with the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships in choosing the path for dialogue. We do not underestimate the challenges, but firmly believe that with bold leadership, peace is possible. The UK stands ready to support all efforts to achieve a lasting and peaceful solution. We recognise that the United States retains a key role in the Middle East peace process, so we urge the United States, Israel, and the Palestinian leadership to find a means of restarting discussions supported by the international community. As I have said, flexibility, pragmatism, and indeed compromise will be needed on all sides. We understand this path is not easy, but we must do all we can to pursue a negotiated outcome. Mr. President, a peace imposed is no peace at all. It will achieve no more than sow the seeds of future mistrust and instability. Both Israelis and Palestinians deserve better. Despite the setbacks, the UK continues to believe profoundly that a negotiated, genuine two-state solution is the only viable means of bringing lasting peace and stability to Israelis and Palestinians. It is the only way to preserve Israel's Jewish democratic identity and realise Palestinians' rights, including self-determination. And it is the only way to bring a permanent end to this conflict. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence, Monsieur Cleverly, de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à son Excellence Monsieur Dang Minh Khoi, vice-ministre vietnamien des Affaires étrangères.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the French presidency of the Council for organizing this important meeting on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. My delegation also wishes to thank the UN Secretary-General and other briefers for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, the Middle East is a region of great geopolitical significance, which had attracted much international attention in recent years. Needless to say, instability in the region can pose multifaceted and complex implications to the international peace and security. Among those, perhaps the situation most desired to be addressed is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unresolved historical, religious, and territorial issues have contributed to the protraction of tension and conflict even since the early years of the negotiation, causing tremendous losses and casualties, especially to the Palestinian people. Vietnam joins the international community in our unwavering support for the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people and their inalienable rights. We strongly support the two-state solution, including the establishment of the State of Palestine with East Jerusalem at its capital, that peacefully coexists alongside the State of Israel with secure and internationally recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines and negotiated settlement, and in accordance with the international law, the UN Charter, and the relevant UN resolution, including the Security Council Resolution 2334. Vietnam has closely followed the situation in the Gaza Strip. We share the international community concern over information on Israeli possible annexation of parts of the occupied Palestinian territory in the West Bank, which, if so, may exert serious impacts on the viability of the two-state solution, as well as to the peace and stability in the Middle East. Vietnam therefore calls on the parties concerned to refrain from any unilateral action that may complicate the situation or escalate ongoing tension. We further urge the parties to continue to exercise self-restraint, refrain from the use of force or incitement to violence. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread in the Middle East, we call on relevant parties to facilitate humanitarian activity to support the Palestinian Authority, respond, and prevent further economic, social, and humanitarian burdens for the Palestinian people. Vietnam supports the continuing efforts aimed at reaching a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through dialogues and negotiation, that helping to protect the lives of people and ensure the legitimate interests of the parties concerned, as well as promote peace, stability, and development in the Middle East. To this end, Vietnam welcomes all initiative and efforts of the national stakeholders and the Palestinian people to restart the Middle East peace process. We will actively contribute to fostering direct discussion between Israel and Palestine within and beyond the United Nations framework. Mr. President, Vietnam also wishes to take this opportunity to express its appreciation and strongly support to the roles and endeavors of the United Nations, the UN Secretary-General, and the Special Coordinator. Of its ability, Vietnam has continued to make financial contribution to the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and calls upon the international community to strengthen budgetary support for this agency in order to provide adequate and timely humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. Thank you for your attention.
Je remercie Son Excellence Monsieur Dang de sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole à Son Excellence Monsieur Alvin Boats, vice-ministre sud-africain des Relations extérieures et de la coopération internationale.